Hi, and welcome to Red Reviews number 6. We've gone over the hump. We are now on our way to 10.
Absolutely, and I think there's no better text tonight than to sort of celebrate getting this far into this kind of series than doing our first theoretical work of Marxism on Red Reviews.
Nice.
So tonight we're going to be discussing Socialism Utopian and Scientific by Friedrich Engels. So my plan over the next few months is I plan to do this one. Some basic fundamental texts of Marxism that I think everybody should have some understanding of. This one's one of them. This one's one of them. The next one we'll do is the Communist Manifesto, which we will probably do sometime later.
That's
in the year.
That's an easy one. I've even read that.
And then in October, we're going to do October will be themed all around the Russian Revolution. So
nice.
October we'll be reviewing State and Revolution by Lenin, and then we'll also be reviewing a history called October, the History of the Russian Revolution by China Miéville. So
very cool.
We'll be doing that'll be all of October. But tonight's going to be our first discussion, our first foray into actual Marxist texts. And so Socialism Utopian and Scientific was originally published in 1880. And it's actually it's like a pamphlet that Engels published at the recommendation of a friend who said, hey, because Engels was, after Marx's death in 1883, Engels sort of became the standard bearer for Marxism, at least until his death in 1895. And in the last sort of decade and a half of his life, he spent a lot of it devoted towards these larger theoretical works, ones that actually Marx wanted to get to but never got around to doing because capital consumed his life, as it does all of us. And so this part of this book that we're going to be reviewing tonight, this pamphlet, was part of a larger work called The Anti-Düring, which is this critique of this dude named Düring at the time who was writing about socialism and science. And so there's a lot of really interesting writing by Engels about the relationship between Marxist philosophy, specifically dialectical materialism, and science. And so he wrote two major works about that. One was called The Anti-Düring, which this thing we're going to be reading tonight and discussing tonight comes out of. And then the other thing he wrote was called Dialectics of Nature. So, people often think of like Marx as it's Marx. But for me, at least, the way I tend to read it is it's Marx and Engels. They go hand in hand. Right. They're Lenin and McCartney, man. Like they're not, And so this pamphlet was very, very successful. And it was the most, alongside the Communist Manifesto, it was the most popular pamphlet sort of popularization of Marxist philosophy in the late 19th century. So everybody read it. And if you're a Marxist, then it's one of those must-read pieces of Marxist literature. So before we get into like the text proper, I have two editions of this. So the edition will kind of be bouncing. So I have an edition that's in the Marx Engels Reader, which is edited by Robert Tucker. This is an excellent primer on Marxism. I highly recommend anybody who's interested in reading Marx or Engels or getting into Marxism, this is the book to get because it has all the important stuff in it in all one volume.
Cool.
And then the other thing we'll be reviewing tonight, because there's a chunk of this that is published somewhere else, where it's from the selected works of Marx and Engels published by the Institute for Marxism-Leninism out of the Soviet Union. That has a long preface at the beginning, which has almost nothing to do, which is very weird. Like there's this very long preface that Engels includes to the edition of 1892 that almost has nothing to do with the text proper. But it's very interesting because I think it's gonna really tap into what this show is all about, which is the intersection of skepticism, sort of secular humanism, atheism, and left philosophy, right? So in this like long introduction preface that he wrote in 1892, Engels kind of lays out how a historical materialist would look at religion and religion's development, specifically in Great Britain.
Oh, interesting.
So to explain for those who don't know, historical materialism is essentially the idea that our material conditions, the mode of production that we live in, determines much of what happens in the cultural or intellectual space. Not all of it, they interact with one another, but they're very much a part and parcel. And so he talks about how in the days of feudalism in England, the materialism of some of the earliest philosophers, people like Epicurus and Lucretius, if you go back to the Greco-Roman period, they were seen as completely unacceptable to the political and economic elite. Right. And what changes is the development of capitalism in England, and specifically the emergence of the 18th century, and in France and in England, specifically the Enlightenment writers. So people like Diderot and Rousseau. Rousseau is a very strong influence on Marx. I mean, I think Rousseau is a strong influence on all of us who are leftists, regardless of your tendency. And how, because of the development of capitalism in England in the 18th century, it made materialism as a broader kind of understanding more acceptable to the public. So people were more skeptical and critical of religion. While at the same time, Christianity goes through a completely sort of ideological transformation as a result of capitalism. So he talks about how the ruling class sort of begins to sort of retrofit Christianity to fit the needs of capital. And so I'm trying to find a passage that I think is particularly interesting about this. And it goes through essentially like how a lot of your sort of listeners will know, a lot of us in secular space will know that sort of the development of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment led a whole new era in which, religion was going to get a far more critical eye than it had during the feudal era. And you have the emergence of skepticism or atheism as a mainstream thing, more of a mainstream thing.
Right. Yeah. Lots of philosophers came out about that time where they were more critical of religion than previously. Exactly.
And so one of the things that's important is that in order for England to sort of succeed as a capitalist society, it had to essentially abandon a lot of its traditionally religious outlooks. So it abandons Catholicism. A lot of people think about Henry VIII and him getting rid of Catholicism in England, establishing the Church of England, Anglicanism, because he wanted to remarry and this and that. And some of that's obviously true. Right. But the other component was that Catholicism was the dominant religious ideology that justified feudalism, and you couldn't really fit it onto capitalism particularly well. And so Protestantism became the new form of it. So interestingly enough, you have all this development of these new sort of radical beliefs of materialism and deism and critical religious criticism, while at the same time you have the emergence of reforms of the political state. So you have like the repeal of you have the reform laws, you have the anti-corn laws. There was the corn laws, which were taxes on imports coming in, and those were repealed in the 1830s. Was part of the levelers. So long story short, and hopefully not to bore anybody, I think this stuff's kind of interesting, is that ultimately what happens is that religion itself, Christianity, becomes the justifying ideology of the capitalist mode of production in England. And that ideologies shift and change based on the material conditions in which one lives, which is a fundamental tenet of Marxism. It's a fundamental component of Marxism. So that's kind of the interesting thing about this long introduction, which seems like a bit of like a tangent. And in some ways I think it is, because it doesn't have all that much to do with the main text, but I think it's something interesting.
For sure.
And then we can, but yeah, that's kind of where I'll stop for a second, and then we can kind of discuss this part, but I just think it's interesting.
Yeah. I think that, like you say, like materialism is a fundamental part of, I think, all leftist philosophy. And, the intersection with religion is kind of, I don't know. We both came out of the atheist community, so that's interesting stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things I think that's also important too is that the religious criticism that exists and develops in the 17th and 18th centuries, through Hobbes, Locke, Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, is that ultimately what it ends up developing is the emergence of liberalism, small L liberalism, as another
Classical
justifying
liberal.
classical liberalism, what people call classical liberalism now, because in the United States, liberal means something very different than it does in like most of the world.
Right.
If you go to England, liberal has a very specific thing. Like the Liberal Democratic Party. I'm not really sure where the Liberal Party in Canada fits in this whole scheme of things. I don't know if are they more like the Democrats or are they more like the Lib Dems?
They're more like the Democrats.
Okay.
Yeah, they want to say that they're more like the farther left, but they're definitely more like the Democrats.
Yeah. And so there's this interesting interrelationship going on in this sort of what they broadly call like the Age of Enlightenment or the Age of Reason, where you have the emergence of sort of radical philosophies in regard to religion, but also at the same time you have this complete transformation of Christianity as the sort of dominant ideology of the ruling class. And so, that's why like John Locke was always a good Christian. If you read his book, Letter Concerning Toleration, one of the classical political philosophy texts, the Declaration of Independence is based on it. The idea of separation of church and state is largely based on this book. He explicitly says atheists do not apply. And so he's limited by his time because, again, he is a Christian. He's writing as a Christian. And so, like, very few of the Enlightenment era were actually explicitly atheists. I think Diderot was one. But like very little of them actually were atheists. This is one of the things I find very frustrating in the sort of atheist movement or the secular movement in general, is their misrepresentation of the Enlightenment, where they sort of think of it as being explicitly and exclusively anti-religious when in fact it was not. The Enlightenment was in many ways a phenomenon of religious criticism to get to the heart of a way of retaining religion through a lens of reason. This is where you get Immanuel Kant's idea, religion within the limits of reason alone. Dialogues concerning natural religion, Hume. And Marx and Engels saw themselves very much in this tradition. I always say that, Marxism is not the rejection of the Enlightenment, it's the fulfillment of it.
Right.
And so, that's why the reliance upon human reason, albeit flawed, and the importance of understanding materialism and material conditions matched with an understanding of history. And I think that's what sets Marxism apart from like classical liberal ideas. I mean, obviously, besides like the whole like, we want to get rid of it and create, communism. Right. The other component of it is it's the understanding of history and understanding that material conditions are predicated upon historical conditions and they interrelate with one another. And so that gets into the heart of sort of the main body of the text. So Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. So what does the title mean? Utopian and Scientific. What does this mean, right? So Marx's project, and Marxism in general, is what they call scientific socialism. Now that kind of sounds probably like a little weird. Let me explain what that largely means. So in the text, Engels talks about how some of the early socialist leaders, those who sort of moved the cause for socialism forward, they're the big three that he talks about. Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, and Robert Owen. Those are the three he talks about.
Okay.
They are all incredibly important to the understanding of the history of the development of modern socialism. But the big issue was that they all had limitations. Each one of those three leaders had some level of limitations.
As leaders are often.
As leaders often do, right? So the problem with Saint-Simon was that he didn't have, one of the things he did understand, one of the crucial elements of Saint-Simon's thought is the idea, Marx writes, Engels writes, knowledge of economic conditions are the basis of political institutions. And that's something that's in Saint-Simon, but it's there in embryo. That's Engels' words. So he doesn't have like the kind of comprehensive view that later writers would have. So he has sort of the inklings of historical materialism, but it's not really developed yet.
Okay.
It's just kind of in the beginning. Then you have Charles Fourier. And Fourier was another thinker who grasped another component of this, right? Because the one thing that Simone didn't have He had this sort of historical understanding and the materialistic conception, but he didn't have dialectics. And Fourier was the other way around, where he had dialectics, but he didn't have the historical materialism. Now, let me explain what that means to people. Dialectics is like...
Dialectics is complicated.
It's extremely complicated to people, but the way to understand it, the very simplistic way of understanding it is, most of Western thought is based on what's called modal logic, which is basically like A goes to B, which goes to C, which goes to D.
Yeah.
Like it's very linear.
Yeah.
It's like a straight line that goes from one end to the other. Dialectics, an understanding of dialectics, is not so much about the straight line. It's more about the interactions of things going together with one another.
Yeah.
You know, one way to think about it is if you think of like the dual split experiments they did in physics, where you have two lines and you have particles going from one end to the other. In traditional logic, you would assume, logically, that they would go in a straight line, the shortest possible line to get from point A to point B, but they don't actually do that. Right. What do? They bounce all over the place. But in bouncing all over the place, they actually do get to the shortest end, the shortest distance between the two, but they bounce all the way around. That's a component of dialectics. It's understanding the relationships between things. So when we're talking about historical materialism, the modes of production influence the cultural systems within it. And the cultural systems influence the material forces of production. And it's like a dance that goes back and forth.
Yeah.
And so that's what dialectics is all about. It's all about understanding the relationships between things and understanding the contradictions between things. So this is where you get into Hegel. And this is something Fourier had. It's this idea that you have the thesis and you have the antithesis. And somewhere in the middle is the synthesis. And that's dialectics. It's finding the balance between the two and it's also about the changing of quality or quantity into quality. So this is something like in biological evolution, right? Where at some point you have so many quantitative changes within an organism that qualitatively they become a completely different organism over time. Dialectics works the same way in understanding society. So at some point, all these like little tweaks and changes that happen within a society eventually qualitatively changes the society in general.
Yeah.
So this is how you go from feudalism to capitalism to hopefully socialism, communism. And those stages. And this is what it gets from Hegel. So Fourier, in Marx's estimation, or in Engels' estimation, understands the dialectical part, but he doesn't understand the materialist part, and he doesn't understand the historical part.
Okay.
And then you have Robert Owen. And Robert Owen is, in my opinion, the most interesting of these three, because he's the guy who's like, it's all great to like think about all this stuff, but I'm going to try to do it. And so,
okay.
So Robert Owen was this 29-year-old man who set up this factory in Lanark, Scotland, that was essentially run as a cooperative. And it didn't succeed, but it had the germ of the idea of what, the idea of communism is, from each according to its ability to each according to its need, right? And what he did was he developed an entire society in which people's fundamental needs could be met. There was a currency within the society that people could exchange for their labor. But ultimately it sort of fell apart. And the reason that it fell apart was because Owen didn't have the class analysis. He didn't have the understanding of class. So he sort of assumed that we would just all unite together and fight against a brutal system. Well, you can't really do that because fundamentally there are some people in that side of the equation who are against you.
Yeah, that's right.
They're against your interests. And so what does this all get us to? This gets us to Marxism. So what's important to understanding of Marxism and why it matters and why it's so influential? And so let's get into what the fundamental things of Marxism are. So you have historical materialism, we've discussed.
Yep.
You have dialectics, we've discussed. And you have class struggle. And those three are all very, very important. And these are things we'll go into more when we discuss the Manifesto, but they're here in Socialism Utopian and Scientific. And so, but he also ties in the scientific component. And this is where you get the concept of scientific socialism. So utopian socialism is sort of this broad kind of, nebulous, brotherhood of man concept, right?
Okay, yep.
Whereas Marxism is rooted fundamentally in a far more empirical, materialist fashion than, say, more of the classical, maybe anarchist or political thought of the previous generations. So Marx and Engels were extremely critical of the sort of anarchist tradition.
Right.
They were critical of Proudhon. They were critical of Bakunin. And fundamentally, what they had a huge problem with was they felt like there was no true theoretical or material understanding of conditions that would lead to the sort of future goals. So it's really nice to talk about like everybody should live in harmony and peace and equality,
Right.
but it's another thing to actually make that happen. And how do we make that happen?
Right.
And so that's really what, that's what Marx gives us and what Engels sort of illustrates. So I'm going to share with you a quote that kind of encapsulates some of this from Utopianism. Oh, and I'm going to share a couple quotes because these are all pretty good, and then we can maybe talk about them. So
Sure.
the pamphlet opens with, modern socialism is, in its essence, the direct product of the recognition, on the one hand, of the class antagonisms existing in the society of today between proprietors and non-proprietors, between capitalists and wage workers, on the other hand, of the anarchy existing in production. So that's super, super important. But then to kind of sum up our discussion so far, Engels has this great quote where he goes, these two great discoveries, the materialistic conception of history and the revelation of the secret of capitalism production through surplus value, we owe to Marx. With these discoveries, socialism became a science. So that's the other the very important component of Marxism that's within this pamphlet and within all of Marx and Engels' work is the theory of surplus value. So everybody knows the labor theory of value. That value comes through labor. Well, Marx takes that even further and says, well, this is how capitalism functions. It functions through the extraction of surplus labor. We're never ever paid what we're actually worth on the marketplace.
Right.
And the reason for that is because they have to extract surplus value in order for it to survive. And then that becomes capital. Today we call it profit.
Yeah.
And so those are the really important conceptions. I know I've thrown a lot out there, so we can kind of stop for a second.
Yeah, no worries. I think, I suppose it's depending on who is listening, there might be more background that they would need, but there's still, I think this is kind of the basics in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I think that it's the basics because these are some of the fundamental tenets of understanding left politics. And I think whether you're a Marxist or not, I think there's just some fundamental tenets of Marxism that sort of apply universally to everything. And so I think these are some of them, right?
I think like a lot of maybe it's stuff that came after, like anarchists that came after have incorporated some of this Marxist type of thinking into the anarchist philosophies, and so it's entwined with almost all left thinking at this point.
I agree. I know there are some people who sort of explicitly identify themselves as non-Marxists, but I think that regardless of whether you explicitly identify as a Marxist or not, some of these are just fundamental facts, which I think, and fundamental truths about society that are very, very important. That's why I would say that, like, in my opinion, the two most important thinkers of the 19th century were Charles Darwin and Karl Marx. They were the two most important, because Darwin and even Engels understands this point and explains this point in this pamphlet, where he talks about how, Darwin understood that nature is dialectical. He says, nature works dialectically and not metaphysically, that she does not move in the eternal oneness of a perpetually recurring cycle, but goes through a real historical evolution. In this connection, Darwin must be named before all others. He dealt the metaphysical conception of nature the heaviest blow by his proof that all organic beings, plants and animals, and man himself are the products of a process of evolution going on through millions of years. And we know, like, historically, that Engels and Marx, and I think more Engels than Marx, both read Darwin.
Right.
And were influenced by Darwin. like no doubt. Because if you want to understand, if you go back to like, the 17th century and you talk about somebody like Thomas Hobbes in his book Leviathan, this political treatise where he's, and he is trying to do this sort of grand universal project that Marx is doing, but he's doing it in a different era. And so he's like, I'm going to be doing for political science or, I'm going to do for society what Newton did for science.
Right.
And set it upon universal laws, right? And Marx is doing the exact same thing, but he's doing it 2.5 centuries later. And instead of Newton being the central influencing force, it's Darwin. Because what Engels and what Marxism teaches us is that society is very much like biological evolution. There's social evolution, there's historical evolution, and then it's based in real material projects, real material conditions.
Right.
And because when he's talking about metaphysics, right, that's another big sort of fancy word. What does that mean, right? Basically what that is the philosophical term that means, things that are outside of the realm of material conceptions. The idea of like souls or God or, spirits or anything like that. It's ethereal. That's not a part of the material, the stuff that you can touch kind of, that you can be a part of.
Right.
And what Darwin does is he completely blows apart that whole notion that society is built around these metaphysical notions, that animals are built around that. And then what Marx does is he does the same thing, but for society, for humans.
Right.
And he blows apart these sort of metaphysical conceptions that are not based in material reality. And this goes back to one of Marx and Engels' most central works, which is a book called The German Ideology, wherein they talk about how, philosophers before them were sort of bringing earth to heaven. And what we seek to do is to bring heaven to earth and to flip the script. And I think that's the really interesting understanding of what it means to think like a leftist or even think like a Marxist.
Yeah, I think, I guess ultimately it's the idea that you can make the world good, right?
Yes, that you can actually make the world good, and we know how we can do that, right?
Right. We can figure this out and actually carry it out.
Yes, and the way that we do that is through completely changing the forces of production. So in capitalist society, the way that forces of production are shaped is that there's incredible amount of socialization. This is the word they'll use. Lenin uses it too in Imperialism, his book Imperialism, that capitalist firms go through increasingly more complicated stages of socialization, basically cooperation, planning. Huge corporations are planning behemoths.
Right.
The reason that like Amazon or Walmart or Google or any of these organizations work so well is because there's an incredible amount of economic planning within them.
Yeah.
Right. But then what happens is that all of that then becomes to the, and this is not to shit on the anarchists, but like basically like it's left up to the whims of the market.
Right.
The market is sort of anarchic in the sort of colloquial sense, because I know anarchism means a very specific thing in political philosophy, but in sort of general, in general terms, there's chaos within the market system, but there's planning within the organizations. And there's this disconnect of like, well, that's why like there's a lot of people that are unemployed. That's why people don't get their basic needs met. That's why, we create food for 10 billion people, but people starve. It's the chaos of, you have the socialization of production, and then you have the sort of chaos of dissemination. And what Engels argues for is that you build a new society in which not only do the means of production become socialized in the sense that they become increasingly planned, but that the distribution of that is also then going to become increasingly planned, and that gets away, And so and how does this play out, right? So one of the incredibly important quotes that he has is, the contradiction between socialized production and capitalistic appropriation manifested itself as the antagonism of proletariat and bourgeoisie. So you have all of this socialized production where people's needs could be met, but then you have all of this chaos within the capitalist system because it's based on profit rather than based on planning or need.
Right.
And those things are going to constantly butt heads, and they butt heads in the form of these class antagonisms between the owning class, the bourgeoisie, and the working class, the proletariat. And that the only way to sort of stop that is to resolve the contradiction. And the way you resolve that contradiction is by completely transforming the mode of production to the benefit of all and to the benefit of the working class. And the reason why Marx and Engels put such a stress on the working class is not because they thought that they were like especially noble or good. It was because they have within their own power the capacity to change the system itself, because they can walk away. So you can have strikes where people just leave. And they also show that with the society with a high degree of planning, you don't need the capitalists. You don't need them. They're these middlemen who basically lord over people and then keep the profits, but they don't actually really serve a useful function. And so that's why, we shape it, we can reshape society so that we can do away with these antagonisms. And ultimately that basically means that we go to communism, and which sounds pretty great.
That's right. Which is kind of the goal, right?
That's kind of the goal, right? And so he talks also about this is a really great quick sentence that sums up, it's a really good, succinct summary of what we've just discussed. So the mode of production is in rebellion against the mode of exchange. So the mode of production is extremely planned and socialized, but the mode of exchange is extremely chaotic and up to whims and market forces that are completely divorced from human need. And those are butting heads with one another. And to resolve it, we create a new mode of production. He also has some interesting stuff. One thing that's an interesting side point that I found interesting is that he's not against he does a really good thing in this little pamphlet about talking about how socialism does not necessarily mean that the government owns it.
Right.
This is something that, and so this is really, really important to understand. So he says the modern state, no matter what its form, is essentially a capitalist machine. The state of the capitalists, the ideal personification of the total national capital. The more it proceeds to the taking over of productive forces, the more does it actually become the national capitalist, the more citizens does it exploit. State ownership of the productive forces is not the solution of the conflict, but concealed within it are the technical conditions that form the elements of that solution. And that basically, he says, the solution can only consist in the practical recognition of the social nature of the modern forces of production, and therefore in the harmonizing of the modes of production, appropriation, and exchange within the socialized character of the means of production. And this can only come about by a society openly and directly taking possession of the productive forces which have outgrown all control, except that as a society as a whole. So he's basically calling for revolution, that the way to solve this is to resolve the contradiction, and you do that through revolution.
Yeah.
And
you can't just elect people who then use the state to change who owns things, I guess.
Exactly. And then within this pamphlet too, you get into the discussion of the withering away of the state, which is something that comes up in Lenin's State Revolution, that the idea that if you move a society, and again, this goes back to dialectics, right? We were talking about how quantity changes into quality, right? Yeah. So if you make all these quantitative changes within the forces of production, eventually, qualitatively, it will change into something completely different.
Yeah.
And so if the proletariat seizes political power and turns the means of production into state property, but in doing this, it abolishes itself as proletariat, abolishes all class distinctions and class antagonisms, abolishes also the state as a state. Here we go. This is probably the most famous quote from the pamphlet.
Okay.
State interference in social relations becomes, in one domain after another, superfluous and then dies out of itself. So he's talking about the withering of the way of the state under socialism, and sort of the broad strokes of it, according to the Marxist and to a certain extent Leninist conception of the state, that eventually what would happen is you have a revolution, the workers take control, they seize the means of production, and you create the semi-state. And the semi-state is socialism, because socialism is, and it's going to have the sort of the birth pangs of the old, where you may still have a state, you may still have markets, you may still have inequalities, but you're moving towards a better system. And then eventually those antagonisms and contradictions wither out by the forces of production changing, and you eventually get to communism. And this is where you get to the most important quote from this pamphlet. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and by the conduct of processes of production. The state is not abolished, it dies out. So that's, I think, the main difference, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, you are an anarchist, I'm not. That's, I think, the main, theoretical difference between, say, our anarchists and Marxists, is that Marxists are like, we would love the idea of no state. But the problem is you can't just like smash the state and make it go away and then expect like anarchism to work. There has to be some kind of administration. And so socialism becomes the semi-state, which then develops into communism. And communism is the stateless society, where instead of having that government of persons, we have the administration of things. And in Marx and Engels' conception, this is where human history really begins. Everything we're living right now is still very much the primitive stages. We're not that far out of the cave.
Right.
We're just not, right?
Yeah.
And so, communism is when you're out of the cave fully and you can see the sun.
Yeah, I think, so under, in anarchist philosophy that I'm aware of, the transition state, we do tend to think that is going to be co-opted by people who are corrupted, and the administration of things is going to turn into just another authoritarian state.
Yes.
So that's where the anarchist is like, yeah, we get where you're coming from, but we don't think that's going to work either.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point. And just to make it clear, I mean, the thing is, like, Marx didn't actually write that much on the state per se. Like, he never wrote a book on the state. Okay. He never got around to it. That was going to be a volume of Capital. I can't remember if it was supposed to be like the 5th or 6th perspective volume of Capital, where he was going to develop his theory of the state and how the state was in relationship to capital. He died. He never got around to it. Right. So everything we know about the state, we know through a bunch of his writings all over the place. And so we kind of developed general concepts of what that would mean. And then Engels, it's the same thing, right? So Engels did write a couple of things about this. So you have The Origin of Family, Private Property in the State, which he wrote. You have obviously the one we're reading now, which has some of this. And then the concepts of the Marxist conception of the state then gets developed further by Lenin. And we'll go into that when we do State and Revolution, because a lot of the ideas that are in this pamphlet that are later on are things that Lenin is going to flesh out more theoretically.
Right.
And so, but you're right. Like, it's a very good anarchist point to say, hey, this sort of semi-state you're talking about, like, it can devolve into Stalinism, right? It can devolve into a sort of, a brutal system that, on the surface looks like you're achieving it, right? But then when you actually get underneath it, you kind of go, oh, wait, this isn't really what it is, right? So that's how some people
still have this massive hierarchical structure, and the proletariat is suffering.
Yep. This is how a lot of people see the People's Republic of China, right? So because I don't know about you, but I actually find like President Xi Jinping's policy letters fascinating. I haven't read. Fascinating. So they're interesting because he's reconciling what the mode of production in China is with Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. So he's like trying to make them work.
Okay.
And essentially what he's arguing for is, we're eventually going to get to the semi-state of socialism. within within a certain amount of lifetime. I mean, the big problem I think we all have on the left, and this is the sort of when is Jesus coming back problem.
Yes,
which is that like
very much so.
Where it's like people are like, oh, any minute now Jesus is coming back. It's like any minute now the workers are going to seize the means of production. Viva la revolution, right? And it's like that's gonna anytime now we're gonna get that worker state, and it's like no. That's not true. And I think
have to at some point do something.
We have to actively fight for it, right?
Yeah.
And that can take many forms, right? So that can take the form of direct action, that can take the form of strikes, that can take the form of political education, which I think is what my expertise is in, I admire the people who are protesters. And I mean, I've been to protests, I've done protests myself, and I love doing them. But, I wouldn't consider myself like a professional protester.
People who do it regularly, I find very admirable. Like
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, this is how I try to articulate to people what I'm thinking. Because I don't know about you, but I see what we seek to achieve as a long-term project. So if we don't die out by nuclear weapons or climate change, this is the long-term project that we can develop, right? Yeah. This is a marathon, not a sprint. I think in our very first, one of our very first conversations together, I talked about how the political right in the United States was essentially, it was like a 30-year project over time where we went from the sort of high liberalism of the New Deal and the Great Society to Reagan. And how did that happen? It was because the political right understood the lessons of the political left. I mean, they understood Leninism. They got it. But they just used it for the political right. Yeah. And used it as a means to create these sort of cadres or vanguards of ideological purity that could then influence the political system. And I would argue that we need to do that again, but from a left perspective. And so I'm not like a sectarianist. I have disagreements with people politically, like I'm a Marxist. But like my thing on the subject is like, if you can create some kind of revolutionary vanguard party, or if you have a trade union party, you have an anarchist, and we're all trying to figure out where we fit in this space to move the cause of socialism, I think that's a good thing. And people often think that Marxists are, we tend to be dogmatic. Some of that's true. Although if you read Zizek and you read Chesterton, sometimes being dogmatic is not a bad thing. But I'll leave that for another discussion. But, long story short, the other thing that's interesting in this pamphlet is he talks about how like nationalization, just if you nationalize industries, that doesn't necessarily mean it's socialism, and all kinds of stuff that's kind of interesting.
I would just lean towards, for certain things, it would be more like a decommodification rather than nationalization or stuff like that.
Yes, and that's the difference, right? And that's exactly what Engels argues in this pamphlet. And so, in sum, what is the difference between, scientific socialism and utopian socialism? Scientific socialism is predicated on a few things. It's predicated on historical materialism. It's predicated on dialectics. It's predicated on the understanding of class struggle. And it's predicated on the idea of understanding the law of surplus value. And having an understanding of each of those things gets you from the sort of nebulous sort of brotherhood of man kind of socialism of like the 17th and 18th centuries to the real systematic understanding of the modes of production and how to change them that you get with Marxism. And then I'll leave you with a couple of really great quotes from the end of the pamphlet where he says, it is the ascent of man from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. That's what socialism is. And I agree, right? We talk all the time about freedom. You hear this all the time from right wingers. They always talk about freedom. It's like, well, freedom to do what? Yeah. That's and freedom for who?
Freedom to buy 30 different flavors of ketchup.
Yeah. Freedom to buy shit, right?
Yeah.
My credit card I use every day literally is called the Freedom Card. Like, that's what it's called.
While they shackle you in chains of debt.
While they shackle you in chains of debt. Exactly, right? So you have that, and then you also have the end of the pamphlet, which is awesome. To accomplish this act of universal emancipation is the historical mission of the modern proletariat. The universal emancipation meaning socialism, the movement towards socialism. To thoroughly comprehend the historical conditions, and thus the very nature of this act, to impart to the now oppressed proletarian class a full knowledge of the conditions and of the meaning of the momentous act it is called upon to accomplish, This is the task of the theoretical expression of the proletarian movement, scientific socialism. And so that's a really great summary of where he's coming from and what Marxism is all about. And in later discussions, we will take this even further, where we will, like I said earlier, we will talk about two fundamental texts of Marxism, where we'll talk with Communist Manifesto, and we'll talk about State and Revolution.
Nice.
So yeah, this is one of the essential pamphlets of Marxism. I highly encourage people to read it. The nice thing about Marxist writings is if you're not like a person who likes books, I know some people aren't always the biggest like book people. People like to read online. All of this stuff is online for free. So you can read it at Marxist. I think it's Marxist.org is the library where you can read all of this stuff for free. And you can download it. You can print it out. You can put it on your phone. You can do whatever. So you can read everything there. And a lot of times the editions that are available on that website are the ones that are the sort of approved texts, the ones that were approved by the writers. They were approved by editors like Robert Tucker, or they were approved by the Institute for Marxism-Leninism out of the CCCP. So it's good stuff. So yeah, that's our first sort of foray into theoretical Marxism.
That's awesome. No, I look forward to hearing more about the other ones. I have read a couple things, like I've read Communist Manifesto. I think these are, some of this stuff is like you say, the fundamentals that you have to, at least to understand some of the left philosophy. But if you aren't a reader, then perhaps our little reviews and discussions will help.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're ever interested in it more, I highly recommend reaching out to other resources. So, I think it's In Defense of Marxism is an incredible website that was really important for me in my political evolution. It's run by the International Marxist Tendency, which is a Trotskyist outfit out of England. But they're great. It's an incredible website that lays out, it has like pages that are literally just like, what is dialectics? What is historical materialism? Like, what do these things mean? Right. And because I think sometimes we think about it's like, oh, this is so like fancy language, whatever. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it all boils down to something I remember hearing from Michael Brooks years ago, which is that the essence of what we're fighting for is there are people out there who took your shit, and your goal is to defeat them and take your shit back.
Yeah,
and that's it,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's perfect.
Awesome.
So I guess, as usual, where can people find more from you?
Sure. So you can find me at justinclark.org. That's where I have my writing, and that's where I have some of my other, public history work. And then I think I mentioned last time, I have an article about Lenin and religion. That's available through Midwestern Marx, which is an online publication. And then I just recently published an article about Robert Ingersoll, my thesis subject. He's right. It's always hard to do this with a video. Right there.
Yeah. Because you're used to it being a mirror, right? But now it's not a mirror.
It's not, right? It's not. And I wrote an article about him and his supposed influence on the work of Lew Wallace, the Christian author. Who wrote Ben-Hur, if you've ever seen that movie or whatever. And then, in terms of things coming down the pike, I'm hoping to, and this is going to be a read review down the road too, but I'm developing this sort of, I'm doing a sort of a dual book review in my head of like, why hasn't socialism caught on in America? Like, and we're going to get two perspectives on that. So we're going to get a perspective from somebody who's like a democratic socialist who's not a Marxist, and then we're going to get a Marxist perspective. Nice. So we'll do that eventually in the future. But yeah, that's kind of what's going on with me. And then the other thing too is I highly encourage people to check out this podcast, become a patron. I am a patron. And if you become a patron, you get to hear all the super spicy stuff we do in the post game. That's right. And so, yeah, I highly encourage people to become patrons because I really believe in what you're doing. And I really can't thank you enough for giving me a platform to do all this really fun stuff.
Oh, thank you for doing it. I cannot often find the time to do the research that's necessary for a show like this, but I think that this is important, and I'm glad that I can have you as a contributor.
Thank you. Next month, we're going to be doing, since it's July, we're going to be doing some sort of we're going to be doing some sort of American history related stuff for the 4th of July. Even though I know Juneteenth is super important too, and I don't want to discount that. And with that in mind, the next book that we'll be doing is another incredible essential work of 19th century thought, which is Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. That'll be the next one that we do.
Cool.
And I'm very excited about that one because we're not just going to talk about the narrative, but we're also going to talk about some of his essays. And most importantly, we're going to talk about one called What is the 4th of July to the Slave, which is an essential lecture that he gave in the 1850s that I think should be required reading for everyone. So we're going to talk all about that. And then the one after that, we're going to be doing Nixon Land by Rick Perlstein, which is the sprawling history of the late 1960s and early 70s. And this is a book in a series of books that he's written on the rise of American conservatism. And I think a lot of the sort of discussions we have today of sort of class analysis versus culture and what is the working class and how do these parties change? All of those discussions were happening back when Nixon was around, and they're very relevant for today. So that's what we got coming over the next few couple episodes.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you.